Hello, everybody. We're going to be working on the chapter 10 content from our book today. And this one's kind of an interesting chapter because it kind of deals with web development from more of like what I would call a holistic standpoint. In other words, kind of looking at it as almost like a job function as opposed to like, what code you're necessarily writing. But the concepts here I think are really important for people that are going into this field because this field is kind of a holistic one by its nature. So what I mean by that is it's not just about coding always when you're doing web development work. There's a lot of other things that kind of come into the mix. So that's really kind of what we're looking at here. So some of it is looking at, what kind of positions that you might have and how do you proceed with an actual project once you're working on one? Are there techniques for it? And the answer is yes, of course. And then we also look at some higher level concepts that you don't often contend with until you get out into the field, but they are really important concepts, and that is looking for hosting and domain names for a website. And when you work with a real project, those are often some of the first things that you look at. And so that's what this chapter is largely about, is really the process of web development is a good way to look at it. When we're working for a company, and there's a lot of these types of companies out there, basically, I think of them as like web design or coding houses. Often these businesses are offshoots of larger IT companies, so it might be a department within a bigger IT company that writes software, or it could be a company that strictly focuses on creating web content and a web presence for businesses as their primary function. So there's variations basically. The other thing that's kind of interesting here too is that you can see from the title of the slide that this is skills and functions needed for a successful large scale project. But what I always tell my students is all of these pieces are also required for small scale projects. And so if you decide to work for a smaller company, these individual job tasks that you see listed here might be job tasks, in a large company that go to individuals. But if you're a freelancer or a small company, you might wear all of these hats or some of these hats in your role. And sometimes you kind of switch, like, hey, I'm working on the database today, and tomorrow I'm working on the graphics, and whatever it is, right? And that's the reality of being a freelancer. But on a large scale project for a large company, it is not unusual. For example, like if let's say we were a big web design firm and you guys were my employees, and we start the day with a meeting. We all come into the conference room or whatever, and I might be the project manager or supervisor, and I might step in and say, okay, where are we at with all the projects? And then everybody speaks up on, given what their role is and what progress they're making or what issues they're having, maybe decisions are made or show and tell happens to show where you're at. But that's not unusual for a large scale company. And the fact that you take all the individual aspects of what you do to create a website and separate them out into very granular roles and very individualized specific tasks that people get. These are some of the things that you will see at large companies. So you would often, for example, have somebody that oversees a department or certain projects. So that would be the project manager. When you're working with a project that is a website that contains a lot of information, you might need to have an information architect. In other words, a person who understands the data that we're using to build the website, what it means, how it's accessed, what we have available to us, that type of thing. Or if we're building it from scratch, what information we would need to store and retain. So an information architect kind of would work pretty closely with like a database person, and in many companies might be the same person, right? the bigger you get, you'll find out that people sometimes deal with information on a conceptual basis. And this is really kind of weird to think about, right? So you could have a job where your job is to think about the data that a website might generate or use and what that's used for. And that's a job, right? And so like the big takeaway from the slide really is that every little piece of what happens to create a website can become a separate full-time career. And so when you're out there looking for work, what you might discover is searching this in like your job search engine might not be enough. Now, Vidal, I want you to pay real careful attention, because you're one of these students that's coming in, you're working on one degree and you're doing web stuff at the same time, right? And so you might really fit pretty well. Like if you understand like how a website is built, but your forte is really cybersecurity or networking, well, notice that the network administrator is part of the team. Why? Because, well, websites are hosted on servers, and servers are connected to networks. And sometimes web applications have pieces that talk across servers and across networks to make them work. And so having a person that understands those things can be pivotal to a project, right? And you can go through all of these roles and kind of think about them. Like, what the heck is a user experience designer? Well, that's somebody who just thinks about how the website looks and feels to their intended audience. That's a whole job. You know what? That's a really good paying job too. User experience designer can make a bunch of money doing that. You might be somebody from the marketing department. It's like, how are we selling this? You know, our client is paying us to do this or that, and we've got to make sure we use the right logo and the right colors, and we're going to push this on social media. If you look at copywriters and editors, well, these are people that actually create the words that go on a page, right? You don't just like have, well, hey, we just hired this intern. Why don't you type up some words? We'll put it on the page. Doesn't really matter too much. You know, that's not the right answer. The truth is the words on a web page matter a lot. You know, and in fact, the words, especially on a home page, matter a lot because it's really big for SEO. You will also have people that strictly focus on the graphics and managing all the content, like how it's organized, like where are we storing this information, how are we pulling it in, is this the right stuff, are these the right graphics, is that picture sharp enough, is that our picture or is it from stock photos? You know, these are all important aspects. For a lot of the websites that we develop, especially as you kind of learn more skills, you will learn that a lot of websites are database driven. So they have a database on the back end that retains some of the information. And often you might have to work with a database person to make that all happen. And then, you know, the part that you guys came to school for, right, is the web developer designer. These are the people that actually code out the website and build it. And that's just one task out of, how many are here? 10? 12? And so this is kind of what happens on projects too. So this might become kind of an eye-opener, is that you have to think about all of these aspects of a project before you start digging in and building any individual piece of it. You know, so that's kind of, you know, the grand goal of all that is like, okay, there's all these different roles in a project. And the web developer is just one out of a dozen. How do I learn all these other things? Well, a lot of those come from either specialization or from experience, you know, or a combination of them. And so whenever you have like a combined set of IT skills that you're bringing to the table, and web content creation is just one of them, it makes you more valuable. So if you can wear a few of these hats, more power to you. You know, and what I would always tell my students is, for example, you know, and this is really a good example. It says the web designer may also be the graphic designer, and this happens in a lot of companies. So we do see a lot of people that go into the graphics field, they end up learning how to code because the job calls for it. Or you're a web person and you know how to code, and then it's like, man, I gotta like adjust these images. I could hire a designer, or I could just figure out how to do it. You know, and so very common to combine roles. So very, very, Common, very, very common. All right. So when you're like working in this field, and one option that you have early on is to work for yourself, and that's one of the things that I did was I did a lot of freelance work, and it was a steep learning curve. I didn't have, like a course like this that I took where somebody told me about these things. I just started doing it, and I started reading, and I started experimenting, and I started Google searching, and I started talking to people, and just slowly built basically an arsenal of information that helped me in the career path, is really the best way to put it. Now, if you're working on a project and you're coming at it more from the management standpoint, like, so you're the project manager and you need to pull people in, you got to find people, right? And so this is one of the biggest challenges of the IT industry and what's happening out there in general in all the IT fields. There are lots of opportunities in IT, but what we find is that people either don't have most of these things. So they don't have experience, they don't have any work that they can show you, a portfolio, they never were educated on it, and they might not be certified in anything. Now, in terms of web, it's really important to note that it's the top three that are really critical. In other fields of IT, so for example, if you're in hardware, or you're in computer support, or you're in networking, or you're in cloud services, or you're in cybersecurity, all of those fields have certifications that match up with the tasks that you do. So like if you're a hardware person, you go and you get your A+ certification, and it shows you have a certain base level of knowledge. The unfortunate thing in web is there's not a lot of industry certifications for web people. There are some, and so I don't want you to make you think that there's not. But in the web world, very few people get hired based on certificates that they've earned. In all the other disciplines I talked about, CSS, networking, cybersecurity, cloud services, for example, where you get a certification, that certification can often directly lead to employment because the employer will say, hey, if you're certified on the AWS cloud platform, we're going to hire you because we need a certified AWS person. And it doesn't really even matter what your experience is. If you pass that cert, you'll work for us. That doesn't work that way in web. Not at all. Web is the one field that is really more driven by this than anything else. So for example, if you walked into a job interview and I was interviewing you, one of the questions I would ask you if I wanted you to be a coder for me is like, well, what do you have to show? What have you done? And you give me a link and I look at it and I go, that looks great. I really don't care in some ways what your work experience or education are. I know you can code. I'm going to hire you. Isn't that kind of interesting? So web kind of has a special place in IT because of it. It is the one field of IT where portfolio speaks louder than anything else. And so why do I have you guys do a launch page is because it's building a portfolio. Even though it's primitive, it does show people that you've coded and what kind of coding you've done. So it is important. Now, I do think, real frankly, that having a formal education helps a lot. Why? Okay, so like you're here learning from me because I've done this for a while and I, supposedly know my stuff. I like to think I do, but, not everybody's perfect. But the point is, if you have a formal education and you're learning specifically about a certain niche in an industry, that education can give you a lot of shortcuts. So I'm going to show you, like, for example, if I show you how to put a video on a web page, if you were going out there trying to figure it out on your own, you might spend days or weeks getting the information together and still maybe not get it. Where if you come to a class, you get it in an hour or two. Maybe you have to refresh it for an hour or two, but you kind of have it after that. So it's a shortcut to getting to that knowledge base. The other thing that happens is being thrown into the actual work world and just doing it. That's invaluable too. So like the actual on the ground experience of doing the work really is huge. It's absolutely huge in IT. I often, I probably have said this many times during the class, students will go, Ty, how did you figure out all this stuff? You know a lot. How did you get there? And it's like, well, it wasn't all at once. I'll tell you that, right? So it's over the course of decades, and as every week or day goes by, you're learning something new and you're adding to your arsenal, and eventually you have this wealth of experience. That happens more quickly when you're actually involved in the actual work, right? So getting out there, having examples, getting trained, all important. Industry certifications in web, not quite so important. Other areas of IT, pretty important. If you think about the list of people that we showed here, right, where some of these, it might make a difference to have a certification. For example, a database administrator or a network administrator, those particular people, if they have certifications in those area, that's important. So I probably wouldn't hire a network person that didn't have certain for example, their CCNA, Cisco Certified Network Associate, for example, probably levels 1 and 2 at the very least, just for example. For a web developer and designer, irrelevant. Some of these other things, user experience designers, that's probably an experience-based one. A marketing representative might have more of a business or a marketing degree or a psychology degree. These people might be English major, journalism majors, communication majors. This is probably a graphic arts or media arts kind of person. Just for example, your project manager might be an IT person with an MBA, a master's in business, for example. So that's why I say it's kind of like this weird little mix. All right, so I want you to take a look at the title of the slide, though. So this is if you're trying to build a team to work on a project, these are the things that you look at, right? So if you're looking to hire, so you're the boss looking to hire somebody. Another thing that a lot of people don't think about is, all right, if you have a business and you want to build a website, do you hire the people who do it? Do you already have a team in place that can do it? Or, let's be practical about this, can I just find somebody to do the work for me, just pay them some money, give them my ideas, and have it built? And you know what? That happens on a professional level too. So it's not unusual if I go to an IT company and say, hey, I need a website. You're assuming they're doing all the work in-house. They might just hire out to somebody else, like a subcontractor that does it. So that's really, really common. What's the advantage of that? Well, if you have somebody that you work with that can crank out the work, I don't have to worry about hiring anybody or what any of these pieces are. You just hire the person, and as a subcontractor, the work gets done. You do it on a contract, and you move forward. All right. So let's say you got your team in place, and now it's time to actually start working on a project. What we're looking at here is, and this is what I would call a very high-level view of a project development lifecycle. And whenever we look at IT projects in general, IT tends to follow a couple of different standardized formats for doing project work. And these are formalized in terms of definition, and a lot of people follow them professionally. So there are companies that maybe don't have this exact development cycle, but really, really close. They might define things a couple different ways, but they have a process that they follow. And in bigger organizations, it's formalized. It's well, first we do this, then we do this, then we do this, and they follow that pattern. I do want you to notice right off the bat that this is a circular, or kind of like a self-replicating cycle. So I'm going to kind of walk through this a little bit, but I just want you to see that it starts with an idea. You kind of analyze, design, build, and then when you have it, you put it out there and you test it. You get the site public, you keep it running and maintained. You always kind of take a look at it and go, what's wrong or right about this? And then you go back to the ideas, and then you make it flow again. So like going through each one of these separately now, let's start with the conceptualizations, because this is where most IT projects start. So in a lot of ways, this can really apply to just website design, or it really can apply to just about any kind of IT project if you really want to open up your mind to that. So very common in web development and software development, particularly. Right. So first thing we do is like, who are we building this website for? That's pretty important. If I was building a website for gamers, I would have a very different kind of audience in mind than if I was building a website for a home remodeling business, or if I was building a website for music fans or health nuts or whatever, whatever the concept is. So you have to know who your audience is, because that makes a difference on how you're designing the site. All right. Okay. Silly questions. You might not even think about this, but why do you need a website? It sounds dumb, right? But what's the goal and the mission of the website? Maybe you want to sell something. Maybe it has nothing to do with selling. Maybe it has to like, hey, this is really fun. I just want to share this with people. Or, you have to think about these things. And some of the goals will be short term. So in the short term, I want to get the info out there. In the long term, I want to turn this into a money maker. Might be real common. The other thing that you do is when you're starting to figure this out is, what are the goals you're trying to hit? So like, for example, real common for a lot of website people is a place will hire you and say, hey, we're only getting 10 people on the website a day. We want to make that 100 people a day. So some people measure the number of visitors and count that as their success. And that could be the case, right? But I think probably more importantly, like if you're selling something, how do you get a person to come to the website and then hang out long enough to click add to cart, check out, here's my credit card number, whatever, and you're getting that revenue in. And what's that percentage? I think it astounds a lot of people that most websites out there, and I'm talking about most like small business, nonprofit, small scale websites, get very, very little traffic, and sometimes astoundingly little. Like, I only had 5 people visit my website this month. That happens, believe it or not. Really what you want to do is maybe get a couple hundred people a day looking at your website. If you get up to that level, chances are you will make a sale, right? So let's say if you can get 100 people a day coming to your website and you can turn 3 of those people into paying customers, and then your average ticket's a couple $100, well, hey, that's pretty good money, right? I mean, you're starting to generate some revenue. So what I think astounds a lot of people is the percent of product sales relative to the number of viewers of a website is measured in single-digit percentages relative to the number of users. So, for example, you might get, 100 people on the website today, but 2 of them might buy something. And that would be considered a success, right? That if you get that many to sign in. All right, so you have to have an idea to start with. From there, now you got to start doing a little bit of analysis, because you got to start thinking about what actually are we doing on this website. Okay, so maybe the project that you've chosen for yourself is just a fun one. And Vidal, you kind of have like sort of a serious topic on yours, and Jeffrey, I think yours is more fun, and both can be pretty valid, I think. But if you look at like these bullet points here, and I think that this is really kind of a great guide, honestly, right? How much of what you're going to put on your website is really just plain old information, right? Now, hopefully that's a pretty big thing, because frankly, what draws traffic to a website and keeps people on a website is the volume and quality of the information. So if you go to a website and there's like nothing there, and it's like, oh great, there's this home site, but there's only 2 pictures of a house and 2 paragraphs, it doesn't tell me anything, I'm out of here, right? That's one mentality. Also, think about this statement. I think this is really kind of, and they're right, this is a very high level concept. Determine what a site will do not how it will do it. You want to really kind of think, you got to break out of this thing of like what kind of code I'm going to use. You got to get that out of your head and start thinking from a high level, like, what is the purpose of this site? Why are people coming here? What is this site going to do for them? I mean, why do you go to a website? Do you go there because the code is cool? Or do you go there because it gives you something? Really important questions. And a lot of people ignore them, right? So they'll create a website that's got like, hey, look, it's got a video, and look, it's got some animation happening, but the website doesn't do anything. It's useless. And then you can go to a website that kind of ugly and doesn't really seem like much, but it has tons of information. So those are important. Now, they also have some, other things here. So if you're analyzing like environmental requirements, and what they mean by that is kind of like the business environment, the corporate environment that you're working within, what hosting platforms or whatever you have available to you, not everybody has everything available to them. Like for example, I'm not Google or Amazon that has a wealth of computer resources. I have this flimsy little hosting account, and I have to put my website up on that. That's my environment, right? Different than if you're like a big corporation, you have like tons of server infrastructure that you could leverage and the expertise to operate it. Also, what is it you really need to put on the website? I mean, do you have content that must be there? And of course, that's relative to what you're doing. If you already have a website in place, another really important one is, should you redesign the website? Does it look dated? That's a big aspect of web work. A lot of people already have websites, but this is 10 years ago, I need to update it. Right? So often that's an approach. I would say that whenever you're in a business field, and whatever it is you're selling, you always need to look at what the competitors are doing in your area, whether it's your online competitors or your area competitors geographically. Let's say like you ran a bicycle shop, and let's say you're in Racine or Kenosha. I would probably Google all the other bicycle shops and look at their websites and see what they're doing, right? Because if you want to compete with them, you got to make your site look better. But I think this is really kind of an interesting thing. What we also kind of think about too, and for a lot of people, this is the first thing they look at, which is silly, is what it's going to cost, right? And so if you're starting from scratch, there's a certain kind of cost involved. If you already have something in place, there's a different kind of cost involved. And then, is the money that you're putting in going to yield a reward? Now, generally speaking, for websites, the answer is yes. I mean, you don't even have to kind of do like the mechanical analysis of it, because you can, for not a lot of money, get a domain name, get hosting, use some really quick and easy website building tools, and get a website up and have it cost you less than a couple $100s a year. And for most businesses, right, that's not a really big expenditure to put in, because if it garners you enough revenue to cover those expenses, and you would hope a business can do at least $200 in revenue, right? You're fine, right? You've made back your cost. Now, reality sets in, right? And those are the costs if you know how to code the site. What happens if you have to hire somebody? I got asked this morning. In fact, I had a business meeting with some people that want to hire me, right? And they were talking to me about like, okay, Ty, you sound like the right guy for the job. What do you charge? Right? And that's a really big question, because a lot of people that come into this field, they see dollar signs in their eyes. It's like, hey, I'm going to learn how to code and I'm going to be rich. Well, there's work involved, right? It's kind of like you can work construction and get rich too. It's just how hard you work. The reality is that talented IT people can make a lot of money, right? And so I was asked, what is my billing rate? And that standard answer, by the way, you guys, should always be, it depends, right? I do have standard rates that I charge, But if I'm quoting to a client directly, it's relative. Am I doing the whole project? Then I'll give you a project price. Are you just bringing me in to do a little bit of work for a few hours? Then I'm giving you my hourly rate. Now, it startles people, but when I was my most recent billing of clients, I was billing at $150 an hour. That's my billing rate. And you'd go, wow, that's a great rate of pay. 8 times 150 times 40 times 52, right? Like you do that math, you're like, wow, you're rich, right? But I'm not doing that all week long, right? People are happy to pay you that if you can get the work done that they need in that short period of time, and are happy to write you the check. Now, from a project standpoint, when I think like a bigger project that might take me weeks or months, I also have this reality. It's like, well, I'm sitting in front of the computer working for 3 or 4 hours, but the truth is I was also watching Netflix and answering a couple of emails, and Facebook was open over there. So my billable rate might drop to half. Now, as beginning web designers, you guys go out there for your first position. It's probably more realistic to expect that an employer is probably going to hire you at a rate of like $20 to $30 to $40 an hour for a beginning web developer, somewhere in that range. And then they're billing the client probably $75 to $100 an hour. And that's kind of a shocker, right? It's the same thing happens to auto mechanics. You go to your car fix-it place, and the hourly rate's like $80, $85 an hour for a car mechanic. And that's not what the car mechanic's actually making. About half of that goes to the shop. So something to think about. But there's other costs involved. So like the more professionals that you bring in, the more the cost goes up. So when you're looking at a big project team working on a project, well, if I have all those people that were on that list before, those prices, everybody gets paid, right? Everybody's got a mortgage to pay and a car payment to make. So it's not unusual for a full-blown web project to start somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $5,000 for a business. That's a starting rate. The more features and capabilities you add to the site, and the bigger the site is, you can get into tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for a really big website build-out. Probably not the kind of projects that most people will work on, but it does happen, right? And then whatever money you're putting in, are you going to bring that money back? Are you going to offset those costs? And one would hope the answer is yes, and many times over, right? The next thing you do, so let's say you've gone through all that analysis and you figured out, okay, this is kind of what we're going to do. Now you start doing what should look a little bit familiar now, is this the concept part of like designing the website. It's like, okay, what kind of site are we building? Is it going to be graphic heavy, word heavy? What kind of look do we want to go for? Are we going to use a certain type of thing? Are we going to be mobile friendly? And you will start doing the user experience design piece, which is kind of doing, and what we see here is like a really rough wireframe. This isn't exactly what the site's going to look like. I mean, you wouldn't have the same ugly picture of the mountains and the moon or the sun or whatever that is, on a website. This is just kind of like, hey, we'll have the logo up here, and there'll be some images over there and some words here. Is all this is showing. And you need to figure this out. The way you design the site's got to be appropriate for your audience. Once again, if you're doing a site about gaming, that's all for fun. Great. That's going to have one certain kind of look. If I'm doing a site where I'm trying to sell homes, that's a very different kind of look, and approach. And you have to, like, you don't just dive in ever and just start creating web pages. You always start from a design. You always start from a blueprint. My standard analogy is, you're building a house, you don't run down to Menards and buy 2x4s, a hammer, and some nails and start going at it. You're starting from a blueprint first, some sort of a drawing, a sketch, an image, a conception. The more detailed that conception, the better. I think I did show you guys last time, like, for example, when I was working with some designers, and kind of like they would come up with the wireframe, or in some cases the pixel perfect design of the website in advance of me building it. Big thing. All right, so you get to the point where you know what you're shooting for, you know what approach you're going to take, you've done all the analysis and whatever, and now you're actually doing the coding. So when we say web development production, this is like what you guys are coming to school for. This is the part that you're learning the code. But I hope now that you're seeing that, like, the build up to it's important too. You know, dealing with the client, dealing with like what costs, what approach, what look we're going for, all that's important. But then you do finally get to the point where you're doing the work and they say choose a web authoring tool. Okay, so you guys have already made that choice. Are you using a primitive tool like Notepad++? Are you using something really advanced like Dreamweaver or Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio? Or are you using some web-based authoring tool? Because those are out there as well. So you figure out what tools you're using, you figure out how you're organizing things, and then you actually get into developing the content. What they don't put here, which I think is pretty important, is there's this conception, at least at this level, that we're always going to be creating the kind of content we're creating now, which is what we call static HTML, and that's not the reality. A majority of the world's websites are built on top of these platforms called content management systems, or CMS for short. The most notable example of this would be WordPress as a piece of software. WordPress is a content management system. It started originally as a blog engine, believe it or not, but it grew into a content management system, and it's estimated that these days that about half of the world's websites are powered by WordPress. And it's more likely as a web developer that you'll work in a platform like that than you will coding straight HTML. And I think that's pretty notable, because this makes it sound like you're going to do all your work as static HTML. That's not necessarily the case. There are some times when that is certainly the more appropriate approach, though. Okay, so you get that website all built out. You know, you got the codes created, whatever tools you're using, all of it's all in place. And notice, the last bullet really kind of says it all. Now you got to test it. The mistake that a lot of us web designers make is, hey, I'm working on a PC, I'm working on Google Chrome, I have my HD screen here, it's beautiful, I have my 4K screen over here, it looks great on these two, what do I have to worry about? Well, here's what you have to worry about. Most surfing happens on phones, right? So we design on big screens and then we look at it on the phone and goes, oh, that's not so great, right? And so that's a mindset that needs to change. You always have to make sure that your website looks good on a phone. I will tell you at this level, right? So for this very first course, I'm not too concerned about that, right? If you can get it to look good on a big screen, that will make me happy for this course. Ideally, whatever website you build will look good on a phone also. So like if I look at like that, the silly House of the Dragon thing that I've been working on here. So if I pull up my Prometheus pages and go to my last, this one here, right? So if you look at like what I have here, so this is at, big screen resolution, and I can test for phone by simply doing this, and hopefully it works. And you notice some parts of it work okay, and some parts of it don't, right? And I would ideally want to fix that. Like I said, I'm not really too worried about that for this class for you guys. But when you start building real websites, it is important that everything works. So if you can get that to work for this class, fantastic. What is the problem with this image? The image, when I reach a certain point, like up until there, it looks fine, and then I get smaller and then it starts to break. How could I fix that? I could simply put this inside of a container, make the width of the image 100% of the container, and then as I would make the screen smaller, it would adjust, right? But you would have to go page by page. So I think a lot of people make this mistake of ignoring the mobile platform ultimately. What I do, and this is what I've done for a really long time, is on my desk, I have a PC, I have a Macintosh Mac Mini up here, I have a couple different laptops. I have Raspberry Pis. I have a Linux machine, and I even have virtual machines of other operating systems. And we try different operating systems, different browsers on each operating system, different types of devices, phones, tablets, computers, big screens, little screens, heck, even television sets. What does your website look like on that? And I would never release a website until I've done really thorough testing. There are tools built into the browser, right? And we've looked at some of these already, where if you go into inspect mode and you can hit this little icon up here, which is the device toolbar, and you can see what it supposedly looks like on different types of devices. Like, for example, is there an iPad in here? So here's an iPad Air. Okay. Now, is this really what it would look like on the iPad Air? Supposedly. What's better than looking at a simulation, though? Actually having one and checking it. So I do happen to have an iPad or two, and so I would try to pull up my website and I would look at it the tall way, and then I would flip it and look at it sideways and see how it looks on both, and then adjust from there. Right, so that's kind of some practical things. Test a lot and make sure, because if your client does happen to be on a different platform and they look at the website, so like you're a PC person and they're a Mac person, you're using Chrome, they use Safari, hypothetically it should look identical, but you never know. And if they look at it on their system and it's horribly broken compared to yours, well, what's going to be their conclusion? They're not going to like it, and they go, this web designer's terrible. It's worse than the last guy. And that's not what you want. So you avoid those problems by doing a lot of testing, and the fortunate thing is there are a bunch of tools out there you can use. So one thing that breaks a lot of layouts is having incorrect code. So make sure that your tool either has validation built into it, or you go to W3 Schools and look at their HTML and CSS validation tools and check for errors, because errors break websites. Always test your HTML first, because HTML structure has to be right in order for CSS to work. Same for JavaScript. So HTML gets checked first, then if that's all good, check your CSS, and then if that's all good, then it's just a matter of the settings that you're making. But as long as your syntax is correct. Just because it validates doesn't mean it looks good, and it doesn't have to be valid for it to look good. So, and these are very frustrating. So you can go to, like, for example, if I go to like some Google web pages and then I ran those through the validator, it might come up with errors, but it doesn't mean it's bad, right? Generally speaking, at our level, you want to make sure the validation tests do pass. So one thing is like testing it yourself, like testing a design, but usability testing is a different thing, and that's how people actually use a website. So people come to the website, what are they drawn to click on? You know how you do this? Is you just let people try the website. And what bigger companies will do is they'll actually have people, they'll sit them down in front of a screen and they'll watch what they do. Say, hey, did you see that? He clicked on that instead of that. And it's all kind of a process of kind of you're designing it a certain way to hopefully channel people into doing something on the screen, but you can never really predict what they're actually going to do until they actually sit down and do it. And so I think that that's a really big piece, is how people actually look at a website. When can you test it? Well, really at any point. I'm always kind of cautious, though, because sometimes when you're building a website, and you've probably already experienced this, is you're working on getting a certain thing a certain way, and then the process of getting there, other things break. And from a designer standpoint, you have to be comfortable with the fact that things might be broken for a little bit until you fix it. And then once you get it fixed, you also have to realize that that's not necessarily the final version. That's the version we have now, and for this current point in time. So how can you do testing? Well, a lot of people do it on pencil and paper, real frankly. They'll just come up with a conceptual design, show it to people. Believe it or not, that's Google's approach. Google has people that walk around with like pads of paper and whiteboards and stuff, and they just draw stuff out and go, what do you think? You like that? All right, we're going to try to build that. Okay, thanks. and that's actually considered testing, right? So you're not going to sit there and like spend hours and hours coding something just to show it to somebody and have them go, no, right? A drawing can do that a whole lot faster. So that's why they say that. It's also possible to do a prototype, and I think I kind of demonstrated this last time, where, for example, I was doing some web work, and I had a design that I was working from, and I'm trying to get the right URL here. This is it. And this is actually what I call a prototype site. So this is not a finished website. It's an HTML mock-up. I was going to build this into WordPress, and it never quite came to fruition. But what I had created was the home page in HTML and the CSS to give it the look, right? And so if I was to build this out into a content management system or a static website, I have all my design structures already in place. And this is not a working website. Anything I click on here does not work. But it shows the look and the feel and behavior of the site. And that's a real common approach professionals is to actually do a prototype. And then, if you can take it to a higher level, and I'll give you an example. Right now I have some students, and I have no idea what state the site's in, right? So it's still kind of in a state of chaos. They're actively working on this website. This is a real live website for a real live client. And they made some tweaks to it last week, and they've kind of left it there, and it's kind of broken still, But it's live on the server, and you can look at it in progress. The client's okay with it because the client knows they get hardly any business on this website or any traffic on this website. But for the students, they have the ability here, because it's a live, public-facing website. They can make edits, and they can see the edits immediately. And all they have to do is like call either the client or their friend or whoever. Hey, check out this link. What do you think? Right. And really, so what they worked on last week, just so you're aware, is they added the logo on the top left, got the menu to sit over here, and then figured out how to put in images that rotate here. Not that these are going to be the final images. These are prototype images to prove the concept. I still think it needs some tweaking, but they're close. Mechanically, they have the process going. So that's kind of, various types of testing, and I think pretty helpful. From here, so after, let's say you got the sites all tested, it's all done, you launch the site, it goes public. If it was not public facing before, you make it public facing, and then you invite traffic to come in. If you're waiting to get paid from a client, you get their final sign off. And what a lot of us in the web field do is usually we work like on a deposit, some money up front. Big web firms do this as well. They get a deposit or payments in progress, and then when the site's done, they get, the bulk of the rest of the payment in the aftermath. Once your client is happy with it, like, this is great, thank you. All the mistakes are fixed, everything's all set to go. And you get that paycheck in your hand. That's a wonderful thing. From there, where we go is maintenance. So whenever you have a site, sites often need to be tweaked. Somebody will find a mistake, or there's new pictures or new content you want to add, or you might need to do a backup, or maybe some of the software that you're using on the website needs to be upgraded. That's all part of the maintenance process. That, of course, maintenance doesn't really happen until the aftermath of the completion of a website. So, in other words, people will go through the process of building it out and then go into the maintenance phase. It is possible as a web designer, both freelance and on a corporate level, that your clients will often sign maintenance agreements with you. And this is something I would always do with my clients. So, for example, I would do a project, and let's say it was a couple month project. And then once it's up and running, I would offer them maybe 30, 60, or 90 days of free updates or fixes. And then after that, they either sign an annual contract with me to maintain the website, or they bring me back on an hourly basis. The long-term contract, if it's like a year or 6 months or something like that, it's usually at a more reasonable rate than the hourly rate. And if they're calling you, for emergency fixes, and the full hourly rate applies. And I've had clients in that situation where they do something to their website, it breaks, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's broken! Help!" And then you just jump in there and make the fix because you know how, and they give you your couple hours of your hourly rate, and you're pretty happy, and they're pretty happy. But really, a maintenance thing is often kind of a really good revenue stream for web designers. So like if you did a really good job building a website and nothing breaks, you might be able to get a little bit of extra income for really kind of doing nothing, However, right, and this is one of the things that comes with website building. When a company is big and the website has a lot of traffic and that website generates all the revenue for a business, the stress level changes significantly. So like if you're working on a site and it's down and the client is losing money because it's down, you feel a different level of stress. And for some people, they don't like that, right? That can be a stressful part of the job, by the way. All right. Now, once the site's up and running and all that, there's always this that happens, and it's really what we call the evaluation part, where you kind of look back on what you did. How did it go? Did it work out? Is this what we expected? If it was all great and hunky-dory now, maybe a couple, 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now, it's not. Things change. A website that you built 10 years ago looked great then, but now people use a different look, right? And so you might decide that you want to redo it. Average lifespan for a website, you guys, is somewhere in the range of like 3 to 5 years before somebody decides to upgrade it or change it. That's pretty typical. Some people go longer than that, but I would say 10 years is kind of like the max you really want to push it before you do a revision. And that process, and I'm just going to go back to the first slide, is cyclical. And it does have a formalized name. This is actually called the systems development life cycle, and there's formal paths of study for it, and a lot of companies employ this on a formal basis in part of their work. All right, I think we're going to do a break here, so I'm going to pause the video. Let's do a 5-minute break, and we'll come back. All right, welcome back from break. And we are going to continue with our slideshow here. Moving on to really what is kind of an important topic in what we do as web people, and that is this concept of a domain name. So if you're not familiar with what a domain name is, it's when you pull up your browser, and I'm going to pull up a brand new browser tab here, and you type in the name of a website. So for example, if I was to go to the Gateway website, I would type gtc.edu, which is the formal domain name for Gateway. So if I press enter on that, it takes me to the Gateway website. And I think a lot of you may be aware of this, but we've also kind of reached this era now where in some ways it's not so important that you necessarily know the exact name of a website, domain name wise, because usually you Google it, for example, and then you find it and then click on the link, right? So that's what a lot of people do, including myself. But in some cases, you want people to be able to know what the name of your website is and go there directly. What a lot of people don't realize about a domain name is whenever you type in a domain name, the reality is that that's not really what you're navigating to. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up the command prompt here on my system. So I am in Windows right now. And for those of you that have never seen an interface like this is called a command prompt. This is where the computer brings up a screen. We in some operating systems we call this a terminal or a console, or a prompt or whatever. And here in Windows we call it a command prompt, and it's really a place where I can do things on the computer by, instead of using a mouse and clicking and double clicking and things like that, I just type commands at the prompt and I can see, for example, the results. So for example, here's a real primitive command. If I'm at a command prompt and I type dir, it's basically a directory listing or looking at the current folder that I'm in, so you can see, what files and folders I have here by typing that command. So I'm in my user folder, I type dir, I pressed enter, so I get this like folder listing. Right? Not super exciting, but I come here for a different reason, and that is to kind of demonstrate a concept. So normally when I go out to the web and I type in a web name, that web name will basically not really take you directly to a place. And this is kind of weird to think about. What happens is when you type a web name into a browser, it goes to a special server out on the internet called a domain name server that looks up your web name and then gives it an IP address of where the server is located and then takes the traffic to that server. And so the trick is basically that whenever you're on the web, any web name that you type in is really an alias for an IP address of a server where the web pages reside. The problem is most of us don't remember IP addresses, or usually, you might remember one or two, but not a whole bunch, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to type this weird little command here at the prompt, and I'm going to ping yahoo.com. Now the reason I ping Yahoo is because Yahoo leaves this service open. A lot of people don't, by the way, but you can type this at a prompt if you're curious. And so what a ping command does is it sends out a signal across the internet and hits that server and then bounces back a message to tell me that the traffic excuse me, that the traffic made it and it's accessible. I want you to notice though, I typed the command ping yahoo.com, and what happened is yahoo.com, that went to a domain name server somewhere out on the internet, probably with your internet service provider or Google or somebody like that, and it looks up the name yahoo.com in their database and says, okay, what name do you have associated, or what IP address, excuse me, do you have associated with yahoo.com? And the answer is 74.6.143.25. Okay, don't believe me, we can take that IP address. I'm just going to kind of slide it over a little bit like this so I can keep the browser open. And I'm just going to type that IP address, 74.6.143.25, and press enter. And it takes me to a Yahoo website. I want you to notice it's not taking me to their main web page. It's taking me to some service page, but it is Yahoo. But the example is basically that whenever you're looking up a name, it looks up the IP address and then goes to the machine. So whenever I'm in a browser here, and let's say I actually go to yahoo.com, it's going out to a domain name server somewhere on the internet. It looks up that domain name, finds the IP address, and then takes you to the website. That's what happens on the back end. So domain name for a website really is a very important thing, right? So like if you have a business and let's say your business is, I don't know, webuyhouses.com or whatever, just using one of the in-class examples here, you want that to be found and you want it to be your own. Okay, so as a business, you often want to get one that's ideal for you. Okay, so new businesses have this problem all the time, because not only are you trying to struggle to find a business name because there's so many businesses that have come before you, but you're also struggling to find a website name. And once again, a lot of people have come before you, so all the .com business addresses are often taken. But the name that you choose is, I think, pretty important, right? There's some that are better than others, so now when you go out there and you choose a domain name, these are some tips from the author. you should describe your business. So, for example, if your business has a name, it might be the best idea to have your business name in the domain name, right? So if your business is like Joe's Hamburgers, maybe joeshamburgers.com is the one you should buy, right? But you could also argue, right, that, well, hamburgers is a lot to type. Maybe it should just be Joe's Burgers. It'd be a little bit easier. Even if that's not the exact name of your business, maybe your name is, Joe's Hamburgers, but your web name is Joe's Burgers. Does that work? Well, perhaps. You can make arguments either way. What they're suggesting is that you're brief. Okay, a really good example of that is if we go back to the Gateway website, their domain name is really short. Now, isn't it easier to type gtc.edu than it would be Gateway Technical College.edu? I mean, that's significantly less typing and also gives like the users more reasons to make mistakes, right? So the longer it is, the more likely they are to make a mistake. The author is also giving a tip to avoid hyphens in domain names, even though they are allowed, right? So for example, you could have Joe's Burgers. That would be an allowable name. The author thinks it's not really a good practice. I'm going to say I think it depends, right? Because I think most people aren't going to type dashes by default. You will notice that domain names never have spaces in them. Isn't that kind of an interesting correlation? So it kind of reinforces what I try to teach you in this class. When you name things, don't put spaces in the naming of things, because that's just not how it's done on the web. There are what we call top-level domains in the web, and so you'll recognize some of these. .com is obviously the big one, but there's also .net, .biz, .us, .mobile, .edu, .gov, .mil, right? Those are what we call top-level domains. And what I like to do for this in particular is kind of demonstrate that a little bit. So if you just go out to Google and you Google top-level domains, and instead of going to all these ad-driven sites, just go to Wikipedia here, all right? And there's kind of a history that goes with this. So the reason that I kind of bring this up, because I think it's pretty important to know this. When we started out with domain names, and what I'm looking for is a list of these. So if they actually have a list, let's see if they have a list here. You know what? I'm just going to research it and see list of top-level domains. And once again, I'm trying to avoid all the ads. Right? I just want to get to information. All right. So when the internet first started, we only had a very small pool of top-level domains, and that would be a top-level domain is the part of the domain name, like what I'm highlighting right now in my URL, which is the whatever.com or .org or .biz or .whatever. That's the top-level domain name. And the thinking in the old days is we won't really need that many. So we'll have some for companies, some for organizations, some networking companies. These can be for international ones. That can be for schools. This can be for the government and the military. And that should be enough. I mean, how many websites are there going to be, really, right? That was kind of the thinking originally. What happened, though, is back in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a gold rush of domain names. So what people would do is they would run out and they would buy every possible .com that they could buy and buy the names of a company, and then basically they would sit on it or squat on it and then they would wait for the real company to come along and want to buy that name from them, and then hopefully make some big money from doing so. And so a lot of like ideal names for a business with a .com extension just don't exist. So like if you were Joe's Burgers and you were looking up joesburgers.com, chances are it's probably taken with a real high degree of certainty. And so what they started doing is they realized, okay, well, we ran out of those domains, And so they started coming up with country code top level domains. I'm going to open that up in a separate thing to kind of solve that problem. So what that means is they added a 2-letter extension to every country on the planet. So there's like a list here of, I think it's like 173 countries, somewhere in that range. And every country has its own 2-letter domain extension. So if you look through this list, you know, whatever country you happen to be partial to, you know, so for example, I have a Greek background, so there is a .gr for Greece, so like websites in Greece often end with .gr, right? What a lot of people don't realize is here in the U.S., we're not excluded from that 2-letter domain thing. We do have a .us, so like that's one domain name, top-level domain that you can purchase. So you could get Joe's Burgers .us or .uk. And this is kind of interesting because when you start looking at websites and you go to websites that have some of these weird extensions, it gives you an idea of like what country they're in, right? So what country you're connecting to. What I also find super fascinating is that most of the world's web servers are actually here in the United States. So sometimes you'll go to like a foreign country website, but their web page is actually hosted in the US, which I think is really kind of goofy. But every country on planet Earth has this 2-letter domain, and it's used to a mixed degree. You don't really see a lot of people here in the US using .us. We just don't, right? What's fascinating though, there's some countries like this one, Tuvalu, which is this tiny, tiny, tiny little island in the Pacific that's a standalone country, that it has its own top-level domain of .tv. And you know what? That's a real popular domain for people that have TV shows. So like you might have, let's say, House of the Dragon .tv, you know, for example. And that's one of their big businesses in Tuvalu, is selling .tv domain names. I think that's diminished a little bit right now. And, you know, it does benefit their country directly, which I think is kind of interesting. But every country does have a top 2-letter domain. Some of the more interesting ones that you might know, like, for example, .ca is Canada, .cn is China. There is a .eu for the European Union. So that's actually for a whole region, which I think is kind of strange. But they are kind of a separate entity, right? So you can have a .eu address, etc. You know, so you can always look it up on a chart like this. Now, because a lot of domain names got purchased up, and the ones that you always prefer are gone, they started coming up with what we call generic top-level domains a short while ago. And this is a special market within the domain name industry where it is possible now to use these other top-level domains. I'm just kind of going to scroll through here, and I think it's pretty interesting. There's a .amazon, .attorney, etc., etc., etc. And a couple things that I think are kind of interesting. So here's one, and I was just giving this example to somebody a little bit earlier today. .cafe. Many years back, I had students working on this website, On the Way Cafe. It's a little broken right now, but this is a student-created website, and this is generally what it looks like. But if you look at the URL here, we had this lady, the one actually in the picture, came to us as a client, and my students in my capstone class built the website for her, and she did not have a website before. And she was like, well, I want to get onthewaycafe.com. That's what I want. And the attitude was kind of like, I won't settle for anything less. Okay, well, here's what happens. How do you know if a website name is even available? Well, you got to go to like a place that sells them to see what's available or not. And so you can go to places like Google. Right now, I'm going to use this service here, which, by the way, is my own company, right? So I'm kind of doing a little promo for myself here. But this is, if you go to webzoe.net, this is my website. And one thing you can do is buy domain names here. So, for example, if you search onthewaycafe.com and you do a search on that, you will notice probably pretty quickly. Oh, actually, now it's available. Isn't that amazing? So she wanted this, like, had to have it kind of thing. But notice what the price is on it. Yeah, it's like they're asking like $2,300 for it. So somebody owns it. So this is an example of squatting, by the way. Somebody owns it. They purchased it probably for about, $15 a year or something, and now they're selling it. So whoever's willing to pay the price, they'll sell the name to them for $2,300. Like, ouch, right? And so, and this is a bitter pill as well, because a lot of business owners will say, you know what, that's great, I'm not going to pay that. They're not going to do it. Very interestingly, in the old days of the web, when a lot of companies, weren't really savvy about this, people went out and they bought, like, for example, Coca-Cola.com was owned by an individual, and Coke had to pay big money to get that name. Miller Brewing, somebody owned Miller.com, and the person that owned that, it was the guy with the last name of Miller, sold it to Miller for really big money, because he got it first, right? So it's theirs. So you end up in this conundrum. You don't know what to get. So they give you, there's tools like this that go out there and give you, well, how about In the Way Cafe, or all these different variations. But I think what's interesting is with these custom domains, and that's what ended up happening on this website. And it was a hard sell on the lady, because this is about 5 years ago that we did this. We're like, this is really a good idea, because it's ontheway.cafe, so your whole business name is in there. And once again, people don't really type into the URL typically. What they'll do is they'll go to Google, type in a search term, find the place, and click on it. That's how most traffic arrives. Another really good example of this is if you look at where the Milwaukee Bucks play. They play at the Fiserv Forum. So I just typed this in as a search, and this is what a lot of people do, right? Fiserv Forum. But if you actually type in Fiserv.forum, and I think this still works. Okay, well, not anymore. But this was their original website address. I'm not sure why they changed it. I'm going to speculate it's probably because FiservForum.com actually came up. But they could have, or they did originally actually have it with a .forum address. So I would always encourage people in the modern era that if one of these new top-level domains matches kind of like what you do, you can just choose one of these, and you can see all the different options that are available, and there's a lot. What's true about this is, depending on where you buy these from, and these can tend to be a little bit more expensive than regular domain names, it is also possible to do custom ones. So for example, let's say you got a really weird last name and you have big money behind you, you can go out there and you can buy that top level domain and then sell it to others, or just have it created, and it does cost more. And some of these, you notice, are handled by very specific companies. So not every company will sell every domain, right? So now you guys should start to ask this other question, and I'm hoping this is what jumps into your head. Okay, so I want to buy a domain name. Where the heck do I go? Right. Okay, so in the old days, you could only go to one place in the old days, right? And this register.com and Network Solutions were kind of one company rolled into one. They ended up splitting, and originally started out as an extension of the University of North Carolina, where they had ICANN, who kept the master database of all the website domain names, right? And so they were in control of it. Then they realized that this could be a business and we could sell it. Then they realized, well, not only that, but other people could sell it too. What's happened is, in the old days, we had very few options. These were in the 90s and early 2000s. Those were kind of the only options. And then you had companies like GoDaddy come up. And GoDaddy right now is probably the biggest seller of domain names. And you can go to these websites and basically look up a web name and purchase it from these companies. The truth is, most of the fees go back to the original ICANN organization, and these companies just make a little piece of profit off the top of each one of these. And every time you renew, they make a little bit of money. And then you're registered in the database, so you own that name, typically for a 1-year period. It is now possible to buy the names for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I think you can go out like 30 years now for a web name. It does cost a lot more money if you do it that way. What most people do is around an annual cycle of renewal, and usually it's like done through automatic payments. So that's a thing to do. Real important change. Okay, so GoDaddy is a big thing. So one of the big things they do is they sell domains, and you can search that on their website. And like, for example, we could put in Joe's Burgers, right, and search, see if that's available, right? Okay, well, .com doesn't look to be available, but .co is. There's also .net, .org, .info, and all these other things. See, joes-burgers.com is available, So it depends on what you're shooting for. If there's maybe a .burgers, maybe that's the best choice, or Joe's Hamburgers or something like that. What you will find, though, is a lot of companies that do sell domain names also sell other services, which is where we're going to go to next. But what's happened in the world of domain names, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is Google's entered into the game now. And Google, if you go to domains.google, see how they're being creative with it? Notice the web name there. This has seemed to become one of these places that might be one of the better places to go to for domain names. So you can see I'm searching Joe's Burgers here on Google. And then I just want you to notice a little bit of the price differential here, depending. They tell you pretty quickly that all the standard endings, what's available and what's not. So .com is taken, so not available. But .net, org, info, and US are all available for whatever price is shown here. What I do like about working with Google, and why I suggest it to a lot of people that are brand new, especially, is that whatever name you pick. So let's say you picked, what's a good one here? Like Joe's Hamburgers right here, XYZ, whatever. When you buy the name, Google includes some things for free that other companies try to charge you for. One of them is privacy, and the other one is what we call an SSL certificate. An SSL certificate on a website is the thing that gives you this lock on the website. Now you will notice you go to some companies and that lock's not there, and it'll say not secure, right? You never want to put your credit card information or any of that kind of stuff into a website that is not secure, by the way. But in order to have that lock on, which just basically puts the faith of the web surfer into a better place, you have to pay money for it typically with most hosts. So like if I was on GoDaddy and I wanted to buy the name and then add SSL, they might charge me like a certain amount of dollars a year for the certificate in addition to the domain name. On Google, that happens for free. And so it makes it really hard not to buy it from Google, just for that reason alone. Not to mention that their regular prices tend to be a little bit cheaper than others. So just a big tip, you guys, if you guys want a domain name, Google's a great place to start, I think. What might make you change your mind is when you look to the other part of it, which is the hosting piece. Domain names are simply buying the web name. Hosting is where you put your files, all right? Hosting right now for you guys as students is we have Prometheus, where you guys have accounts created and can use that web space to do whatever you want, right? And it's not proper hosting though, but it is free, right? You guys don't have to pay for it, and it works, right? Not the true hosting experience though. One thing I do give a tip to people, like let's say, your name is Joe Smith. I'm trying to find something really super generic. it's not a bad idea to own your own name as a website address, right? So just think about this. Let's say one of you like hits it big and gets famous or whatever, and then you think about, well, I should have my own website, right? Why not get it now, right? Because you might get famous later. So I did that, like for example, if you look me up, and this should not come up as available, I would hope, but first and last name, .com is taken. And who is it taken by? Me. Right? But, .co is available and all these other ones. And why would that be important? Well, if I want a website about myself, I own my own name. And you know what? If you're a freelance designer or whatever, it's not a bad idea to own that, even in advance of it actually becoming something. So I think that that's pretty fascinating. Another question that people have very often is, well, if I see a name I like this is taken, for example, how do you know who actually owns it? And this is really kind of interesting. And it says here, we still might be able to get it for you. Well, first thing is, just so you know, I'm not selling, but they're willing to take your money to try. I think that's pretty fascinating. And that's a whole business too. And so what these services do is they wait for a person to see if they renew. Once your renewal date comes up, I think you have a 30-day window in which to renew after it expires. And if you don't renew in that 30-day window, then it's up for grabs to the internet. And then the broker would buy it and sell it to whoever's interested at a little bit higher price. And that's how they make their money. So I think that's a pretty fascinating little thing. But what if you want to figure out who owns the website? So what you do is you type who is. Now, anybody that's done any networking stuff might be familiar with this command here. But who is basically an online database, and there's actually a whois.com, and then there's the ICANN lookup, which is the official one. And actually, that's where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to ICANN because they're the official one. But all the services pull off the same database from ICANN, just in case you're familiar. So if, for example, I wanted to search to see who owns this, I would put in the name of the website address and do a lookup. And what it does is it pulls down all the registration information from the public database. Now you will notice on mine, because I do own this one, that the registration is set to private, right? So in other words, I paid extra or whatever, or used Google, which is more intelligent, and you get this for free, where it obscures your personal information. If you don't have the privacy setting put on here, so I'll give you an example. I'm thinking that Gateway probably doesn't. So if I look up gtc.edu, oh, I see. Okay, so they don't look up .edu addresses. All right, how about this? Let's look up coca-cola.com. I don't know if theirs is privatized. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff is redacted for privacy. But if you do not put the privacy piece on here, I'm not pulling one up, unfortunately, that doesn't have privacy. What is exposed is the name, address, phone number, email address of the registrant, right? So if you don't pay to privatize that, everybody on the internet who looks you up can find you. And it is a source of spam. So the privacy is recommended, but it is possible also through what we call a whois lookup to find the owner of a website in principle. Okay, so it doesn't always work if the privacy is turned on. So I think those things are all pretty important. So let's say you got your domain name, and now it's time to take all the stuff that you've built and designed and put it out on the web. Like I mentioned before, here at school, we have the Prometheus server, so we use that. We give students an account, and you can put stuff into your folders there using an FTP program, and then the world can see your web pages. Web hosting, on the other hand, is a little bit different. And in fact, web hosting is how most people put websites out online, and it's not free, right? Not that you could not take a machine, even on your own home network, turn it into a web server, Open up your router to public traffic and then run a website from your own house. That's totally doable, right? It is a thing. Is it recommended? Absolutely not. It's not recommended because it exposes your network and your machines to the possibility of being attacked and all sorts of other things. So not what I recommend. Strangely enough, in the old days when I first got into this game, I did exactly that. I would run my own hosting servers. I would pay for really big pipes up and down to the internet and host web pages for clients that way. Not a smart move, by the way. Later on, I eventually switched to a hosting platform where I could do all of that at a much lower cost, without the maintenance, without the security worries and all that. So where do you get web hosting? Well, a lot of times you get web hosting from the same people you buy your domain names from. So really, good example is GoDaddy. And then the reason I bring them up is because they are the biggest in the game. And you notice mine goes to GoDaddy Pro for some reason, probably because I use it, right? And you see what it does, it automatically takes me back to Pro. But if you want to look for hosting, you can just kind of do a generic search, and I'll show you some other companies too. But there's different types of hosting, and I don't know if you noticed from like that drop down. So there's regular web hosting, you can host for WordPress, for e-commerce, or you can actually get entire servers. So if you want to have your own server, that's a possible thing. And instead of building it yourself, you can just buy the service from a company. For what we do as web designers, most of what we'll do is just going to be in the regular web hosting category. So I'll just go there, and then you can look at the different levels of service that they have and what they bring you. And this is fairly typical. You will find places that do what we call a lot of loss leader pricing, and GoDaddy's no example. So, and I always caution people on this. It's like they'll put a price on the screen and you think it's a good price, but it's the renewal price that's the real price, right? And so what they're doing here is they're willing to give you the economy for $6 a month if you prepay for 3 years, right? Otherwise, actually it's $9 a month. So you got to read the fine print. Some hosting companies, and GoDaddy's one of them, is pretty good about telling you that up front. Others, and we were looking at one with a client earlier this morning, we were looking at this one, DreamHost. And when I went to their website and started looking at their hosting, they didn't quite do that, I had to I guess they were providing it, but they were saying that, okay, well, hey, this is a better price, right? But what they're telling you here is that you have to pay for the whole year up front, but otherwise the regular rate is $6 a month for this level of hosting, and it shows you what you get included. Now, this is kind of interesting because I want you to notice that this hosting plan does include a domain name. A free domain name is included, but I'm assuming that's only for the first year. So if you hit the question mark, then you probably have to scroll and read. Yeah, so there's some stuff there. So I don't know what their domain names cost in the aftermath, and you go to the domain name part to look for it. But it's a pretty standard game that web companies do, is they'll give you pricing up front, and that pricing changes. It depends on the level of service that you need. If you're just doing one website, there's a domain name included, unlimited traffic, WordPress is pre-installed. That may or may not be what you want, by the way. That might be the thing you sign up for. The other option it looks like they have here, at least on this service, and notice what they do here, 3-year, so this is the game they play, right? So if I go to monthly, okay, so now here's more the real price. If you do a 1-year prepay, the price comes down. You do a 3-year prepay, even lower. But it depends. Now, interestingly, a lot of these hosting services, and this is typically the level of service I recommend for people, is one that gives you unlimited websites. So if you can imagine this, if you're paying a monthly fee and you can have only one website or you can have a whole bunch, why would you not choose the whole bunch? If you're a designer, you could do work for people and host it right inside your own account, and it's all right there for you to control, right? Or if you just have a lot of interest, let's say you have like a business interest, a gaming interest, or whatever, you can create all these different websites and put them all in the same place. So there's some appeal to that type of an approach, and you get more for your money, generally speaking, that way. I think this is a pretty fascinating area to study. There's no quick and easy answers on this. If you guys are looking for other people that do hosting, I'll give you some of the big ones. So here's HostGator. This one I think is notable for a couple different reasons. They tend to be, in many cases, I think a lot of pros prefer to work here, as their website says, and they usually either go to HostGator, 1-in-1. DreamHost is pretty big. Bluehost is pretty big. GoDaddy's pretty big, because those systems really work really well, and they have good support. One thing, for example, if you look at DreamHost and you try to get support here, which is kind of interesting, you can't call them. All right, so that might be an issue for you. GoDaddy, on the other hand, have a phone number you can call. And it looks like they're trying to push you away from calling, but they do actually have phone numbers you can call and talk to somebody, So that might be, what you need to do if that's an issue for you. You shop around is basically what you do, and you find the service that you need. If you're really curious about hosting, because it is something that does cost money, right? And what I tell people is kind of on average, if you have a domain name that you're paying for every year and you're paying for hosting, you kind of expect to spend somewhere around $120 to $150 a year, for typical hosting. That type of hosting is usually called shared hosting. That means that you're on a server where other websites are hosted too. And that's fine for like 99% of most people on the web, by the way. Shared hosting works just fine. So there's that cost and that piece involved. But what I tell my web students is, when you're working on Prometheus, that's all well and good. You can experiment a lot, but that's not a real web host. It's not a bad idea as an aspiring web person to buy yourself a domain name and to get yourself some sort of hosting that you can play with, so that you actually have a place where you can try stuff for real, right? It's not really a big investment, and it really kind of gives you a lot of options for learning about this in a much deeper and more profound kind of way. A number of years back, I was teaching this very class, and I had one of my students, and it was actually a pair of brothers, now that I think about it. The brothers said, "Hey, we use X10 hosting. You should check it out." Right? And so I went to it and I checked it out, and I want you to notice it's free and unlimited. All right. I'm like, okay, great price, right? The catch is, whatever you do on this website, your website name will be, for example, joesburgers.x10hosting.com. So X10 hosting always is part of it. So they're kind of getting advertising, I guess, right? You put a website up for free, but you're still kind of pointing to their servers. If you want your own domain name to stick on this platform, you have to pay them for that. But that's cheaper than signing up for most hosting, by the way. What's kind of neat about this one is it is a full-featured hosting account. So there is all the standard website tools on the back end of the website that you can log into, just like a real hosting account. So you have access to a real hosting control panel that allows you to control the website, so you get that experience without having to pay money. So I really like this one. The only catch with it is that once every 30 days or 60 days, you have to log into the control panel and just log in, and then your account stays active for free. If you don't log in, they take it away. They figure you're not interested, so they just take it away. So if you're looking for free hosting and you want to play with one, this is one that I highly recommend. And I think they allow you to load 2 websites for free. If you go beyond that, you pay. If you attach your domain name to it, you pay. But otherwise, if you just want to experiment, this is a great way to experiment. So I really recommend this one a lot. All right. As you start to look at, the different types of hosting, right? A lot of things you have to think about. So for most small businesses and small organizations, you really don't need a lot of capability, real frankly. As long as it can run whatever software or web pages that you're loading up, you're good, right? And it can handle the traffic. However, really big, busy websites do sometimes have this issue, and I'm sure you guys have seen these commercials where people have like a website and they put it up and they get a couple of hits and they're like, woohoo! And all of a sudden they got 10,000 hits and it's like, uh-oh, how do we handle all that traffic? And the website starts to choke. So one thing that we think about is different levels of hosting. For most of us, we'll be using what we call virtual shared hosting, which is a bunch of websites on one machine. And this is usually adequate for most people. However, if you expect your website to be super, super popular, like you're getting like 10,000 hits a minute or something like that, virtual hosting is not going to cut it. You really do need dedicated servers for that, and probably redundant dedicated servers for it with lots of RAM, lots of storage space, and lots of bandwidth set aside to it. So it's relative to what you do. If you were working on a project of that scope, you would know it way up front. So for example, when they built like healthcare.gov, when they put Obamacare into effect, they knew that was going to be huge, so they didn't start out with like a shared hosting account. That was just not going to cut it. They had to have, high level dedicated equipment that ran just that. So you had to think about all of these things. All right. Interestingly, when you do start to move to higher levels, and the prices go up significantly, it is possible to buy a lot of different services from a lot of different vendors, and often what, like more, I guess, savvy or, experienced tech people will do is often they will actually move to a dedicated server. Sometimes those dedicated servers are located right within the company. So for example, when Gateway launches their web pages, we have it on our own servers at Gateway, right? Because we have the infrastructure, so we can do that, right? A lot of other people don't have an IT department or racks of servers or battery backup or generators that kick in or redundant lines to the internet, all those things, right? And so a dedicated server sometimes is a really good thing. You can house that yourself, or you can buy that service from somebody, same kind of difference. There's also this concept of a co-located web server, which is more of like buying it from another company. So for example, let's say HostGator or GoDaddy or somebody is selling us the use of a server, but that server is in a rack with other people's servers, and they have people that are at that site managing that machine, but that one machine is all yours to use, but it's just located in the same location with other people's equipment. That is actually a much more common approach than people having their servers on site. Gateway is kind of anomalous that way. A lot of big companies, in fact, as a matter of practice, use co-located servers on purpose. So for example, I can think of a couple of big companies here in Milwaukee, like Northwestern Mutual and Harley-Davidson, both use a data center in Kenosha for all their servers. Now you're like, why would they do that? They're in Milwaukee, And here's the thinking. It's like, well, what if Milwaukee has a disaster or an atomic bomb strikes or, zombie apocalypse? I don't know. If something happens that drops Milwaukee off of connectivity, like a bomb drops on their main building and knocks them out. Well, all their servers are in Kenosha. Their data's fine. So that's kind of the thinking. So that's the strategy, to not have your servers in the same building where you operate, for security. It seems like the opposite of security, but in essence, it really is. When you start, choosing, the kind of level of hosting that most people need, which is the virtual hosting, you start thinking about, okay, well, if I'm buying virtual hosting, I need to make sure that it has certain capabilities, right? Because I'm running all these pieces of software or applications or databases or code or whatever it is, and you need to know what you're running and what it requires to run. Now, most web servers do run on top of a Linux operating system, generally speaking. I'm not sure what most web hosts are doing these days, but in the past, they were really pretty big on CentOS, CentOS, which is a variant of Red Hat, which is often like kind of pre-built for doing website hosting. And so a lot of web hosts use that, or they find some other real popular variant of Linux that's built for doing the same thing. Now, if you host on a Linux server, that will have different capabilities than if you're hosting on a Windows server. And, you know, we haven't talked about this yet, but when you code, I mean, the static HTML and CSS and JavaScript that we code for any web page will work on any web server, you know, because they're universal languages. However, when you start to get into proprietary languages, so when you learn like languages that are built to operate in a Windows environment, you then need a Windows web server to operate that stuff. Or if you have a Windows database and a Windows software base to operate your website, then you have to be on a Windows platform, and guess what? That costs a little bit more, right? And so these are all things that you look at. You look at, you know, how much data can you move per month? Most hosts now are unlimited, but in the past you used to have to pay by the gigabyte. You know, so you'd get so much a month, and if you would exceed it, they would charge you for it. How much disk space you get, how many email accounts you get. And do you have access to the hosting control panel? Can you set up databases? Can you install e-commerce packages? Are there backups built in? Yada, 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 right? And there's a lot of details about it. And so you can, unless you know the service you're dealing with, you can't usually just jump in and click buy and be done with it. This often, you know, buying a domain name, choosing the right web host is sometimes days or weeks worth of research and investigation before you find the right platform. And sometimes, unfortunately, you have to try a platform, dislike it, and move on to a different one. And hopefully that doesn't happen to you. But if you stick with one of the big companies, generally you're okay. And if you're curious about that, like if you just do a search, domain names and hosting, and press enter and do a search, you're going to find so many different options here. And you will notice that most of these services will sell both the hosting and the domain names. And there is some advantage, by the way, to doing that in one spot. You know, if you buy the services all in one spot, they tend to work well together. If you buy domain names in one spot and hosting somewhere else, there's usually little extra challenges to make things work. If you want it to be as seamless as possible, you buy all from one service provider. All right, folks, that wraps the presentation on Chapter 10. So I'm going to stop the recording.